Every person alive knows the name. Stalingrad. It echoes like a gunshot. It feels like history's hinge. Like the moment the war cracked open. Like the single breath before everything changed. But what if that's exactly what they want you to believe? Not historians. Not soldiers. Not the dead buried beneath Russian snow. What if both sides, Soviet and Nazi alike, needed you to fix your eyes on one city, one battle, one moment? What if Stalingrad was never the turning point? What if it was a story? A myth so perfectly constructed that 80 years later, the world still swallows it whole? Here is what nobody tells you. The war was already decided. Long before the rubble of Stalingrad. Long before Field Marshal Paulus surrendered. Long before the flags changed hands. The outcome was sealed in a moment quieter than you'd expect. In mud. In frost. In a collapse of strategy that happened 14 months earlier, in the frozen suburbs of Moscow, December 1941. But first, let us talk about what you think you know. September 1942. The Wehrmacht is unstoppable. Hitler's war machine has devoured France, Poland, Yugoslavia, North Africa. 3 million German soldiers have poured into Soviet territory. The largest invasion force in human history. Nothing has stopped them. Nothing has even slowed them. City after city. Division after division. The Red Army bleeds and retreats and bleeds again. Then comes Stalingrad. A city on the Volga. A city that shares a name with Stalin himself. That detail alone makes it symbolic. That detail alone makes surrender impossible for either side. The battle becomes personal, psychological, ideological, street by street, floor by floor, room by room. Men killing each other over staircases, over walls, over rubble that used to be factories, hospitals, apartment blocks. The Soviets wiped out the German Sixth Army and a Panzer Army, leaving a massive hole on the Eastern Front. The Germans never fully recovered. That is the official story. That is what gets taught. That is what gets filmed, dramatized, repeated until it becomes fact. But here is the problem. Turning points don't announce themselves. They don't come with symbolic city names. They don't come with dramatic surrenders. They come quietly. In bad decisions made months earlier. In supply lines that stretched too thin. In armies that expected victory in 10 weeks and found themselves still fighting in a second winter. Then a third. Professor Robert Citino of the University of North Texas, when pressed for the real turning point, didn't say Stalingrad. He said, the smashing of Wehrmacht formations in front of Moscow in December 1941. Cambridge historian Richard Evans agreed. That was the first time the Germans are actually stopped in their tracks and they don't know what to do. These aren't fringe voices. These are the scholars who have read every document, translated every military log. These are the people who know where the war actually broke. So why does Stalingrad dominate the story? Because Stalingrad is cinematic. Stalingrad has a general surrounded. Stalingrad has Hitler screaming. Stalingrad has frozen soldiers eating snow. It has a body count that horrifies. It has images that burn into memory. Moscow in December 1941? Muddier, slower, less dramatic. A German offensive that just stopped. A front line that froze. A mythmaker's nightmare. The Battle of Moscow ended the Germans' intention to capture the Soviet capital, and that, according to Britannica, ultimately doomed the Third Reich. Not Stalingrad. Moscow. A full year earlier. But nobody made that movie. And that silence is exactly the problem. Here is the mystery. 2 superpowers. 2 propaganda machines. Both pointing at the same battle. Both needing you to believe the same myth. That is not coincidence. That is coordination without communication. That is 2 enemies arriving at the same lie for completely different reasons. Ask yourself, why would the Soviets need Stalingrad to be the turning point? Because Stalin needed a narrative. He needed a story of Soviet suffering transformed into Soviet triumph. He needed a city named after him to be the place where fascism broke. He needed his people, 60 million dead by war's end, to believe the sacrifice meant something. that the horror had a hinge, that everything before Stalingrad was darkness, and everything after was the march toward Berlin. Kursk, Stalingrad, Moscow, the Soviet war narrative moved deliberately. From city to city, from battle to battle, building a mythology so seamless that even soldiers who had not fought in those places tried to write themselves into the history. That is what state mythology does. It doesn't just describe history. It manufactures meaning from it. But now the darker question. Why would the Germans need Stalingrad to be the turning point? Because the alternative is worse. Far worse. If Stalingrad was the turning point, then Germany lost because of a city. Because of overextension. Because of one catastrophic tactical decision in 1942. That is a story of near victory. A story of heroic failure. A story the Wehrmacht could almost live with. But if Moscow was the turning point, if the war was already lost in December 1941, then Germany never had a chance. Then the invasion was doomed before it truly began. Then 3 million men died not because of a bad decision at Stalingrad, but because the entire premise of the war was a delusion. That is not a story armies tell about themselves. Operation Barbarossa rested on false beliefs and faulty intelligence, with military planning that could not adapt to prolonged resistance. It did not account for the size, the ability to recover, or the resources of the Soviet Union. In other words, Germany walked into a war it was structurally incapable of winning. Not at Stalingrad. From the very first day. And both sides buried that truth. Under 600,000 German bodies. Under the rubble of a city on the Volga. Under the name Stalingrad. To understand the strategy, you have to go back. Not to Stalingrad. Not even to Moscow. You have to go back to the morning of June 22, 1941. The moment the plan was born. The moment the delusion was set in motion. More than 3 million German and Axis troops invaded the Soviet Union along an 1,800-mile front. It was Germany's largest invasion force of the war, representing some 80% of the Wehrmacht. One of the most powerful invasion forces in human history. That number should terrify you. 80%. Everything. Germany committed everything to this one campaign. There was no reserve plan. No fallback. No strategic alternative. Win fast or lose slowly. That was the entire calculation. And for weeks it worked. The panzers moved like lightning. Soviet divisions collapsed before they could react. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured in the first month alone. The Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,000 Soviet aircraft on the very first day. Cities fell. Supply lines buckled. Stalin himself reportedly went into psychological shock in the first days of the invasion. The machine was working exactly as designed. But here is where the strategy begins to rot from inside. German spearheads advanced over 500 kilometers, some reaching as far as 600 kilometers into Soviet territory in the early stages. But by October 1941, they had moved beyond their supply capabilities. Tanks ran out of fuel. Infantry were worn out. Vital supplies remained far behind the lines. They were winning. And winning was killing them. The deeper they pushed, the longer their supply lines stretched. The longer those lines stretched, the more vulnerable they became. And the more vulnerable they became, the slower they moved. And speed, raw, unrelenting speed, was the only thing Blitzkrieg had ever actually been. Remove the speed, and you don't have a strategy. You have an army standing in the open, in a country the size of a continent, waiting for winter. By mid-July, the Germans had advanced more than 400 miles and were only 200 miles from Moscow. They still had ample time to make decisive gains, but they lost the opportunity, primarily because of arguments between Hitler and the OKH about where to strike next. This is the moment. Right here. This internal argument. This is where the war dies. Hitler's generals wanted Moscow. Moscow was the nerve center, the rail hub, the psychological capital. Take Moscow and the Soviet command structure fractures. Take Moscow and Stalin's authority collapses. Take Moscow and the war ends before winter. But Hitler said no. He looked south. He wanted Ukraine. He wanted oil. He wanted economic territory. He overruled his generals. He redirected his armored forces. He bought himself 6 weeks of hesitation while the Soviet Union breathed, reinforced, and prepared. Hitler ordered, over the protests of his generals, that the drive against Moscow be delayed in favor of focusing on Ukraine to the south. 6 weeks. That is what Moscow cost him. 6 weeks of Russian autumn, turning to Russian mud, turning to Russian ice. 6 weeks that meant when Germany finally turned back toward Moscow in October, the window had closed. The temperature had dropped. And waiting in those frozen suburbs were fresh Siberian divisions, soldiers trained for Arctic warfare, wearing the right boots, carrying weapons that worked in -40 degrees. The Germans had none of that. They had summer uniforms. They had engines that seized in the cold. They had frostbite spreading through divisions that were already exhausted from 5 months of advancing. By Christmas 1941, German armies had captured 3 million Soviet soldiers, and the Soviets were still fighting. That sentence should stop you cold. 3 million captured. And the enemy kept coming. That is not a country on the edge of collapse. That is a country with reserves so vast they defy military logic. Germany had no answer for that. Had never planned for that. Had never even imagined it was possible. The strategy was built on one assumption: that the Soviet Union would break quickly. It didn't. And the moment that assumption failed, in the mud outside Moscow, in December 1941, the entire war was already over. Everything that followed was consequence. Stalingrad was consequence. Kursk was consequence. Berlin was consequence. The decision was made in the summer of 1941. In an argument between a dictator and his generals. In 6 wasted weeks pointing south instead of north. In a strategic miscalculation so profound that no amount of battlefield heroism could ever correct it. That is the real strategy. And that is the real failure. Hidden in plain sight. 1 year before Stalingrad's first shot was ever fired. December 5, 1941. Moscow's suburbs. Temperature: -35 degrees Celsius. The German advance has stopped. Not from orders. Not from strategy. From physics. Engines won't start. Rifles won't fire. Men's fingers are breaking off inside their gloves. The most powerful army in human history is frozen. Literally frozen. Standing 20 kilometers from the Kremlin spires. Close enough to see them. Too broken to reach them. Then something happens that nobody predicted. The Soviets attack. Newly created Soviet units near Moscow numbered over 500,000 men. On December 5th, they launched a massive counterattack that pushed the Germans back over 200 miles. Read that again. Over 200 miles. The Wehrmacht, the army that had never been pushed back anywhere, retreated 200 miles in weeks. Divisions that had terrorized Europe. Divisions that had dismantled France in 6 weeks. Running. In the snow. Back the way they came. This is the shock event. Not Stalingrad. The Battle of Moscow ended the Germans' intention to capture the Soviet capital, and it ultimately doomed the Third Reich. Hitler's response? Rage. Pure, uncontrolled rage. He dismissed his commander-in-chief of the German army, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, and appointed himself as replacement. A painter. A corporal from the First World War. Now personally commanding the largest land war in human history. From a bunker. Against generals who had spent their lives studying warfare. That decision alone should tell you everything. Because what it reveals is panic. It reveals a man who had built his entire identity around an invincible military machine, and was now watching that machine shatter in real time. So he did what all cornered authoritarian minds do. He blamed others. He seized control. He convinced himself that his will alone could reverse what physics and strategy had already decided. Despite the failure and huge losses of Barbarossa, Hitler launched another major strategic offensive in June 1942, this time toward the Caucasus and the oil fields beyond. But the factors that caused Barbarossa to fail now conspired to doom this new enterprise as well. That new enterprise had a name. Case Blue. And inside Case Blue lived a city. A city on the Volga. A city the world would soon know as the turning point. But the turning had already happened. In the snow. In December. in a collapse that both sides would spend decades trying to erase from the center of the story. The shock was real. The cover-up was realer. Think about what December 1941 did to the human mind. Both sides, simultaneously, in opposite directions. For the German soldier standing in that snow, something broke that could never be repaired. Not a supply line. Not a tank division. Something deeper. The belief. The absolute, unquestioned belief that Germany could not lose. That the Wehrmacht was invincible. That this war had a predetermined outcome and they were on the winning side of it. That belief was the actual weapon. More powerful than any panzer. More devastating than any Luftwaffe squadron. An army that believes it cannot lose fights differently. Moves differently. Takes risks differently. Absorbs casualties differently. Moscow took that weapon away. Richard Evans, Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, identified December 1941 as the moment the Germans were stopped in their tracks, and crucially, the moment they no longer knew what to do. That last phrase, they no longer knew what to do. That is not a military assessment. That is a psychological autopsy. An army that doesn't know what to do is already a defeated army. The body just hasn't received the message yet. But the psychological damage ran in the other direction too. For Stalin. For the Soviet command. For every Red Army soldier who had spent 6 months retreating, surrendering, dying in numbers that defied comprehension, Moscow was something else entirely. Moscow was proof. Proof that the machine could be stopped. Proof that German soldiers bled like anyone else. Proof that the winter was theirs, not the enemy's. Soviet forces, better adapted to the conditions, launched their December counteroffensive led in part by Siberian divisions trained specifically for Arctic warfare. Hitler's war of annihilation had provoked Soviet resistance rather than weakening it. Provoked resistance. That is the critical phrase. Every atrocity the Wehrmacht committed on Soviet soil, every village burned, every civilian shot, every prisoner starved, became fuel. Became motivation. Became a reason for soldiers to keep fighting past the point where any rational military calculation said stop. Germany created its own worst enemy. Not through bad tactics. Through ideology. Through the decision to treat an entire people as subhuman. That decision transformed a military conflict into something more dangerous. Into a war of annihilation that the Soviet Union was always more equipped to survive. Hitler brought a blitzkrieg. Stalin returned a glacier. Slow. Inevitable. Unstoppable. And it had already begun moving. Long before Stalingrad lit the sky. Now we expand the lens. Pull back from the frozen suburbs of Moscow. Pull back from the individual soldier. From the frostbitten fingers and the seized engines. Pull back until you can see the entire war from above. From the altitude where strategy lives. Where economics breathe. Where the real reasons nations win and lose come into focus. Because here is what the Stalingrad myth consistently obscures. The war was never purely military. It was industrial. It was economic. It was a production battle fought in factories 10,000 kilometers from the front line. And in that battle, the battle that actually decided everything, Germany was losing from the very first day. In 1942, the USSR produced 24,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 127,000 guns and mortars, and 25,000 aircraft. Over the same period, the Germans produced 9,000 tanks, 12,000 guns and mortars, and 15,000 aircraft. Sit with those numbers. The Soviet Union outproduced Germany in tanks by nearly 3-1. In artillery by 10-1. In aircraft by almost 2-1. And this was 1942, the year Germany was supposedly still competitive. The year before Stalingrad's conclusion. The year the myth says the war was still winnable. It was never winnable. Not with those numbers. Not against that production capacity. And it gets worse for Germany. By 1943, American Lend-Lease was providing 17% of Soviet aircraft, nearly 16% of guns and ammunition, and 14% of vehicles. America wasn't even fighting on the Eastern Front. America was supplying it. Trucks, radios, food, the logistical infrastructure that allowed Soviet armies to move, communicate, and sustain themselves across a front that stretched thousands of kilometers. Germany had no equivalent. Germany had no ally feeding its war machine at that scale. Germany was alone against an industrial alliance it had no answer for. The crushing Soviet superiority was made possible by the immense capability of the Soviet economy to produce standardized tanks, guns, and equipment, and by the capacity of the Soviet state to mobilize the enormous human resources of the largest country on Earth. Both abilities were the result of Stalin's industrialization drive of the 1930s. This is the part that gets buried deepest. Stalin's purges. Stalin's gulags. Stalin's brutal collectivization that killed millions. All of that horror had a byproduct. A modernized, centralized, state-controlled industrial base that could be turned toward war production with terrifying efficiency. The Soviet Union did not just survive the German invasion. It outmanufactured it. While burning. Germany never understood what it was walking into. But now pull the lens wider still. Beyond economics. Into geography. Into the fundamental physical reality of the Eastern Front that made German victory not just unlikely but mathematically impossible past a certain point. By mid-July 1941, the Germans had advanced more than 400 miles and were only 200 miles from Moscow, but they had lost the opportunity for decisive gains, primarily because of strategic arguments about where to strike next. 400 miles in weeks. That sounds like dominance. But 400 miles in Russia is not the same as 400 miles in France. France is a garden. Russia is a continent. Every mile the Wehrmacht advanced was another mile of supply line to defend. Another mile of rail track to maintain. Another mile between the front soldier and the food, ammunition, and fuel he needed to keep moving. Napoleon learned this. In 1812, 129 years before Barbarossa. He marched into Russia with the greatest army Europe had ever seen. He reached Moscow. He stood inside it. And the campaign still destroyed him. Not because of a battle he lost. Because of the space itself. Because Russia simply absorbed his army and broke it against the winter. On June 22, 1941, German forces began their invasion of the Soviet Union, nearly 129 years to the day after Napoleon Bonaparte had done the same. Like the French dictator before him, Hitler hoped to subdue the enemy quickly and secure victory within weeks. The date was almost identical. The outcome was inevitable. And German military planners knew the Napoleon comparison. They had studied it. They had concluded the comparison didn't apply. They were wrong in the same way arrogant men are always wrong. Completely. Catastrophically. Without the ability to see the error until it was far too late. Now bring the lens back to Stalingrad itself. Because the battle did matter. Let nobody tell you it was meaningless. 2 million casualties. A city reduced to dust. The German Sixth Army annihilated. These things were real. These things were seismic. But seismic is not the same as decisive. Historian Richard Overy put it precisely. Stalingrad was not a turning point in strategic terms, because much more still had to be done before the Soviets could be certain of defeating Germany. Much more had to be done. That is the key. After Stalingrad, after this supposedly war-ending moment, the fighting continued for 2 more brutal years. Kursk in the summer of 1943. Operation Bagration in 1944. The grinding, catastrophic advance through Eastern Europe. Hundreds of thousands more dead on both sides. If Stalingrad was truly the turning point, what were all those subsequent battles? Footnotes. Afterthoughts. No. They were the war. Still being decided. Still costing lives at an industrial scale. At Kursk, the Soviets massed 1,300,000 men, 3,600 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 2,792 aircraft. One source states the Soviets employed 40% of their manpower and 75% of their armored forces for that single battle. You do not commit 75% of your armored forces to a battle if the war is already decided. You do not mobilize on that scale if the enemy is already broken. Kursk tells you, in raw numbers, that the Eastern Front remained genuinely contested well after Stalingrad. That the outcome was still being fought for. Still being paid for in blood. The turning point myth collapses under that weight. What Stalingrad actually was, what it genuinely represented, was a psychological watershed. The moment the world outside began to believe Germany could lose. The moment neutral nations reconsidered their positions. The moment occupied populations began to imagine resistance as something other than suicide. That is real. That is significant. But it is not the same as being the moment the war turned. The war turned in a frozen suburb. In December. In 1941. In a silence so complete you could hear the German offensive dying. Stalingrad just made that death visible to everyone watching. Every empire has a moment where the collapse becomes internal. Where the structure does not just bend, it begins eating itself from within. For Nazi Germany, that moment arrived not at Stalingrad. Not at Kursk. It arrived in Hitler's own headquarters. In the arguments. In the dismissals. In the slow disintegration of command itself. After Moscow, Hitler had fired his army commander. Appointed himself. After Stalingrad, he fired more generals. After Kursk, more still. Every failure produced the same response. Not adaptation. Not honest strategic reassessment. Blame. Purge. Control. A furious Hitler dismissed the commander-in-chief of the German army and appointed himself in his place. Army Group Center was pushed back up to 150 miles from Moscow. Think about the compounding effect of that decision. Germany's most experienced military minds, men who had studied war their entire lives, were being systematically removed and replaced by the unchecked instincts of one man. A man who had never commanded a division. Who had never managed a supply line. Who confused willpower with strategy and stubbornness with strength. Every dismissal made the next defeat more likely. Every defeat produced another dismissal. The Wehrmacht was not just losing battles. It was losing its ability to think. And the Soviets, doing the opposite. Where Germany's command structure collapsed inward, Soviet military leadership was quietly evolving. Generals like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky were learning. Adapting. Absorbing the brutal lessons of 1941 and building something harder, sharper, more sophisticated from the wreckage. The Red Army of 1944 bore almost no resemblance to the shattered force that had reeled backward in the summer of 1941. The subsequent Soviet victory meant they had seized the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front and would hold on to it for the remainder of the war. From that point, the Germans were on the retreat, a retreat that would take them all the way back to Berlin. That retreat began in December 1941. Outside Moscow. In the cold. Everything after was geography. The distance between that frozen suburb and Berlin was just the physical measure of Germany's collapse. Played out over 3 years. Paid for in 3 million German lives. By the time Germany officially surrendered, 80% of its casualties during the entire war had come on the Eastern Front. 80%. Not Normandy. Not North Africa. Not the Atlantic. The East. Always the East. Where the war was lost before most people believe it even turned. The collapse was not an event. It was a process. And it started the moment Germany's army stopped moving forward in the Russian winter and realized, for the first time, that it did not know how to stop moving backward. Here is the twist. The one nobody sees coming. The one that reframes everything you just absorbed. Stalingrad was not chosen as the turning point because it was the most historically significant moment. It was chosen because it was the most politically useful one. And the terrifying part? Both enemies chose it simultaneously. Independently. For completely opposite reasons. Arriving at the same myth from opposite directions. That is not history. That is something darker. That is two authoritarian systems, one defeated, one victorious, unconsciously collaborating across decades to protect the same comfortable lie. The Soviets needed Stalingrad because Moscow told the wrong story. Moscow said the Soviet Union nearly broke. Moscow said Stalin's regime came within hours of collapse. Moscow said the capital was days from falling, that panic had consumed the city, that officials had fled, that the outcome trembled on a razor's edge. That story does not build monuments. That story does not justify decades of communist sacrifice. So Moscow gets buried. And Stalingrad, clean, heroic, total, takes its place. Many historians felt that Stalingrad was too late as the instant when the course of the war fundamentally changed, and that the launching of Operation Barbarossa itself may have been too early a marker. But professional historians consistently see the Eastern Front as providing the inevitable turning point of the entire conflict. The Eastern Front. Not one battle. The entire front. The entire grinding, industrial, existential collision between two totalitarian systems. That is where the war was decided. Not in a single cinematic moment. In 3 years of relentless attrition that broke one side's capacity to replace what it lost. And Germany needed Stalingrad because the alternative was nihilism. If the war was lost from June 22, 1941, if 3 million men crossed that border into a campaign that was structurally unwinnable, then every death that followed was not sacrifice. It was waste. Pure, catastrophic, ideologically driven waste. No nation builds an identity on that. So Stalingrad becomes the almost, the near victory, the noble defeat snatched from heroic hands by impossible odds. Both sides needed a moment. Both sides needed a name. They chose the same one. Winston Churchill framed it precisely. Stalingrad was the end of the beginning. But Kursk, and before it Moscow, was the beginning of the end. The beginning of the end started in the snow. In silence. In a collapse so complete that two superpowers spent 80 years agreeing never to look directly at it. You just did. And now you cannot unsee it.